Welcome back to Era 7 of the AP US History curriculum. In this video, we will be looking at topic 7.6, World War I, the Home Front. So let's get to it. During World War I, the United States economy shifted into high gear to provide the materials needed, not just for the US military, but for many of the Allied countries, especially Britain and France. Between 1914 and 1917, U.S. industrial production increased by approximately 32%, and this was even before the U.S. officially joined the war. During that time, the total value of U.S. exports had grown from $2.4 billion in 1913 to $6.2 billion in 1917. Cotton, wheat, brass, rubber, automobiles, machinery, wheat, and thousands of other raw and finished goods were sent to the major Allied powers. By the end of 1918, American factories had produced 3.5 million rifles, 20 million artillery rounds, 633 million pounds of smokeless gunpowder, 376 million pounds of high explosives, 21,000 airplane engines, and large amounts of poison gas. The flood of money into the manufacturing sector from both home and abroad led to a rise in employment for American workers, with the unemployment rate dropping from 16.4% in 1914 to 6.3% in 1916. This provided job opportunities for both minorities and women as well, since so many white men were joining the military, and this prompted many to move from rural areas to take up work in the factories. But we'll talk more about that in a bit. In addition, wages increased dramatically, doubling from an average of $11 a week in 1914 up to $22 a week in 1919. This increased consumer buying power, which helped stimulate the national economy in the later stages of the war. To coordinate the purchase of war supplies, the U.S. government established the War Industries Board. It encouraged companies to use mass production techniques to increase efficiency and urged them to eliminate waste by standardizing their products. The board set production quotas and allocated raw materials. In addition, Congress passed the Food and Fuel Control Act, creating the Food Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, future president, and the Fuel Administration. The Food Administration encouraged farmers to plant more crops and for the American public in general to reduce their consumption of certain commodities, especially meat and bread. There were voluntary meatless Tuesdays and sweetless Saturdays. Tuesdays and Saturdays were also porkless. Both Mondays and Wednesdays would be labeled as wheatless. Bread was nicknamed Victory Bread if it used grains other than wheat. Citizens were also encouraged to plant victory gardens, growing their own vegetables to substitute for what was being diverted to the war effort, which by war's end was about 1/4 of all food produced in the U.S. The Fuel Administration regulated the price and production of fuel, particularly coal, to ensure a steady supply and prevent price gouging. Non-essential factories were shut down, and Americans were encouraged to save fuel with gasless Sundays, heatless Mondays, and lightless nights. Over the course of the war, more than 4 million people had entered the military, and more than 500,000 joined the civilian government. More than 3.5 million people joined the non-agriculture private sector, mostly in manufacturing positions, which was an increase of about 12%. Interestingly, agriculture lost some of its positions, employing about 1.4% fewer people, but farmers as a whole were making more money than ever before, mostly because of price support from the government, keeping many farmers working their farms. For example, wheat prices almost tripled in 3 years, the price of wheat going from 78 cents per bushel in 1913 to $2.12 per bushel in 1917. And farmers were among those who were temporarily exempted from military service, although they were allowed to enlist if they wished. And of course they could be drafted if the supply of potential draftees ahead of them was exhausted. And remember, you have all that new farm machinery improving efficiency in terms of production on the farms. To accommodate the needs of wartime productions, thousands of Americans moved to cities where work was available. This is particularly true for African Americans, who participated in what came to be called the Great Migration. The first Great Migration, lasting from about 1915 to about 1930, saw about 1.6 million people move from mostly rural areas in the South to northern industrial cities. Black Southerners moved north and west in several different migrant streams that generally depended on the transportation available to them. African Americans from the East Coast typically went to Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and New York. From the Middle South, black residents of Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky moved towards Chicago and Midwestern industrial cities, where car manufacturers and related industries began to employ African American workers. Those from Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas went to places like St. Louis in California. A second Great Migration would occur after the Great Depression and bring millions more to the cities of the North and West, but we'll talk about that in future videos. A combination of both push and pull factors played a role in this movement. Despite the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, African Americans were still subjected to intense racial hatred. The rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan led to increased death threats, violence, and a wave of lynchings and murders. The cities of the North and West were an opportunity to escape the dangers of the South. Rural African Americans also had worked mostly as sharecroppers, not owning their land and frequently finishing the year in debt to white landowners. The spread of the boll weevil that decimated the cotton crop after 1892 prompted many to leave for cities, as their living and working conditions were not unlike that of slavery. In addition to this push out of the South, African Americans were also pulled to the cities by factors that attracted them, including the opportunity to earn a wage rather than being tied to a landlord, as well as the chance for vote. Well, for men at least. Ideally without the threat of violence. Although many lacked funds to move north, factory owners and other businesses that sought cheap labor sometimes provided assistance. Often, the men moved first and then sent for their families once they were established in their new city life. Job opportunities were created for women as well. When millions of men were sent into the military, the drain on the labor pool created a need for new workers. Suddenly, women were able to break into jobs in truly significant numbers, some of which were ones they had previously been frozen out of, like heavy industry, munitions, and police work. Many also entered into clerical positions, sales, and garment and textile factories for the first time. In addition, over 30,000 women worked in the military, mostly in the nursing corps, but some were even able to enlist to work in clerical positions in the U.S. Army Signal Corps to free up men to go to the front. But this opportunity was recognized as temporary during the war and not sustained when the war came to a close. Women were frequently forced out of jobs that were given to returning soldiers, and the wages women had been paid were almost always lower than those of men. Now, not everyone was happy about Wilson's decision to get involved in the European War. Some were just reluctant, and some were adamantly opposed. To try and unite the nation behind his decisions, he started a propaganda campaign pushing an America First message, which sought to convince Americans that they should do everything in their power to ensure an American victory. To achieve this, Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, headed by George Creel, so it's also known as the Creel Committee, to inspire patriotism and present America as a nation that was rescuing Western civilization. Anyone who wasn't supportive of this idea was considered disloyal. Those of German descent faced particular discrimination, whether they opposed the war or not. Sometimes their businesses were boycotted or even attacked. Some cities changed the name of streets and buildings if they were German, and some cities even changed their names, like Berlin, Iowa, which became Lincoln, Iowa. Libraries took German-language books off the shelves. The music of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms disappeared from music programs. Schools stopped teaching the German language. And German-language newspapers either started printing in English or just shut down completely. Some things were even temporarily renamed, like sauerkraut and hamburger, which became known as Liberty Cabbage and Liberty Steak, respectively. In an effort to restrict opponents from speaking out, Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918. These laws essentially made it illegal to speak out against the war or do anything to interfere with the draft. More than 2,000 persons were charged with violating these laws, and many received prison sentences of up to 20 years. Immigrants faced deportation as punishment for their dissent. Challenges to the laws reached the U.S. Supreme Court, but restrictions were upheld by the court. In the case of Schenck v. United States, Charles Schenck, as a member of the Socialist Party, had tried to hand out pamphlets urging men to resist the draft. He was arrested, and the court upheld this restriction of civil liberties because, as they argued, freedom of speech was not absolute. In other words, when speech constitutes a clear and present danger, then it is constitutional for it to be silenced, much like a person is not permitted to yell fire in a crowded theater. One notable prosecution was that of Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs, who received a 10-year prison sentence for encouraging draft resistance, which was considered giving aid to the enemy. Prominent socialist Victor Berker was also prosecuted and subsequently twice denied his seat in Congress, despite being properly elected by the citizens of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Continuing after the war, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who was fearful that there was a possible communist takeover of the U.S. looming, appointed J. Edgar Hoover, later the head of the FBI, to organize the capture and arrest of suspected radicals, especially those labeled as anarchists and communists, and deport them from the U.S. Part of the reason for this growing fear of radicals and communists was because of the success of the Russian Revolution just before the end of the war. This fear led to an increase in xenophobia, which is a fear and distrust of those from other countries, which will lead to immigration restrictions in the 1920s. They gathered information on suspected radicals and eventually ordered the arrest of more than 10,000 people in a series of raids across more than 30 cities in 23 states in 1919 and 1920. Everyone present at the site of a raid would be arrested, whether they were a member of the radical organization or not. And of all those arrested, more than 500 were deported. Most press coverage of the raids was positive, although thousands of the arrests were later deemed illegal, and some groups criticized the actions of the Justice Department. In fact, the American Civil Liberties Union was founded partly in response to these actions. Now, in the last decades of the 19th century, the number of people immigrating to the U.S. increased tremendously. During the Gilded Age, which was 1870 to 1900, almost 12 million immigrants arrived in the U.S. That's almost twice the number that had arrived since 1820. That number increased to over 14.5 million for just the first 2 decades of the 20th century. These people were fleeing crop failure, land and job shortages, rising taxes, famine, political and religious persecution, and, of course, war. The introduction of large steel steamships also reduced the cost of travel, meaning even more people could scrape together the money needed to move to the U.S. The vast majority arrived from Europe, especially Germany, Ireland, and England, though through the 1880s, although a relatively large group of Chinese immigrated up through 1882. By the 1890s, there had been a shift, and new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were becoming the most important forces in the American immigrant story. They entered the U.S. through several major ports. Those coming from Europe went to the East Coast, and those coming from Asia to the West Coast, mostly. But more than 70% of all immigrants arrived in New York City, which was nicknamed the Golden Door. Although many of these immigrants settled in urban centers, not all of them stayed in the U.S. permanently. Some were just coming to work for a number of years before returning to their homelands. Now, as I mentioned, xenophobia was increasing in the U.S. during and immediately following World War I. Isolationists began nativist campaigns to limit newcomers, especially after the war, particularly targeting Southern and Eastern Europeans. Incidentally, this is where Marxism and communism was on the rise, as well as increasing various barriers to Asian immigration. In general, nativists were unhappy that many of these immigrants were not Protestant. Poles and Italians were mostly Catholic, plus you had Eastern European Jews arriving in significant numbers. This nativist sentiment led to the introduction of immigration quotas, first with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and later with the National Origins Act of 1924. Both of these taken together set quotas for accepting new immigrants very low, especially immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as Asia, basing the number allowed off of a tiny percentage of the number that were already here by 1910 and then by 1890, respectively. There had already been some restrictions enacted earlier, but most of those had been to bar criminals, those carrying certain diseases, or even those who were illiterate in their own languages. The exceptions to that had been the Chinese Exclusion Act dating back to 1882 and the Gentleman's Agreement affecting those coming from Japan in 1907, both of which had targeted groups based on their national origin. And remember, nativism wasn't anything particularly new in the U.S. It does date back to the 1830s, which at that time had mostly targeted Irish immigrants. World War I had expanded that to target those of German descent, but the 1920s essentially was seeing it expanded even further. And with groups like the Second Ku Klux Klan, they were explicitly nativists. They were very anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-Black. They really didn't like a lot of people. And their influence stretched far beyond the borders of the old Confederacy, and actually had the greatest numbers from the upper Midwest, at least until they began to decline due to internal corruption issues by the mid-1920s. Well, that about covers what you need to know about Topic 7.6, World War I, the Home Front. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.